Hello, and welcome to another episode of Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. In this episode, we'll be discussing one of the key issues at the convergence of the healthcare and technology sectors, namely regulatory implications and emerging issues stemming from the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in medical devices. I'm Luke Bergstrom, a partner in Latham's Bay Area offices and global vice chair of our technology industry group. And joining me today are my partners Elizabeth Richards and Ben Haas. Liz and Ben are both partners in Latham's Washington, D.C. office and members of our healthcare and life sciences practice group. Both have extensive experience advising clients at all stages of their life cycle with the regulatory, compliance, transactional, and legislative matters involving the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. Ben and Liz, welcome and thanks for taking time to speak with us today.
Great to be here, Luke.
Yeah, it's great to be here today, Luke. And before we get into the substance of the discussion, perhaps we can sort of level set this exciting field for investors. AI is a promising and growing sector for PE investors and companies alike. Although the application of artificial intelligence in healthcare does require careful navigation, principally due to the evolving regulatory requirements in the US and worldwide. Investors, companies, other stakeholders are all excited about the potential use of AI in healthcare because it can drive value and efficiency, such as improving quality control, allowing for the precision diagnoses and improved outcomes, clinical decision support, and the better orchestration of the delivery of healthcare. For developmental stage companies, AI also has the potential to shorten approval timelines and reduce development costs by allowing targeted research in patient subpopulations that may benefit from an investigational drug. With those benefits, though, come risks. And Liz, perhaps you could tee those up.
Yeah, it's true. A primary headwind to developing products in this industry and additional investing in healthcare AI is the unclear and evolving regulatory picture, which may lead to a potential wait-and-see approach as the regulatory structure matures. Today, we're going to be discussing that landscape, that current regulatory landscape in the U.S. for AI in healthcare, where it's heading, and FDA's efforts to address the rapid pace of innovation in this sector.
First, how is artificial intelligence and machine learning being used in medical devices?
I think to really understand how AI and machine learning are being used in medical devices, it's important to level set with an overview of how FDA regulates medical devices writ large and the scope of its authority over these products, insofar as software can be sort of a novel category of product. In the United States, FDA has jurisdiction over a large percentage of the economy, over 30%, and that jurisdiction extends to a number of product categories, from drugs, dietary supplements, tobacco products, to those articles that meet the definition of a medical device, which is defined quite broadly to include an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or similar or related articles, including components or parts of those articles, which are intended for use in the diagnosis of a disease or other condition, or in the cure or mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or animals, or that is otherwise intended to affect the structure or function of the body in man or animals. So the key aspects of this definition is that it refers to an article or contrivance that is intended essentially for a therapeutic use. FDA has interpreted this quite broadly to extend its authority from all manner of products from on the low end of the spectrum, or at least with respect to risk, tongue depressors, toothbrushes, to complicated technologies used in the hospital, such as artificial pancreas systems and blood glucose meters.
FDA has taken the position that, this definition of a medical device is broad enough to swoop things in that you might not traditionally think of as, quote, an article or a machine. And indeed, FDA has considered software to fall within the scope of that definition if it does have that, intended use to affect the structure or function of the body or for use in, diagnosis of disease or other conditions or cure, mitigation, or treatment or prevention of disease or other conditions. This software could be standalone software, like a standalone software program, or it could be software used as a component of hardware. And while there are certain exemptions for certain kinds of software, that do not are not subjected to FDA oversight, if the software is not subject to those exemptions, it may be subject to significant regulatory oversight by virtue of the software being deemed a medical device. So specifically, once we pass that threshold question as to whether something is a medical device, the next question is going to be, how will it be regulated? What set of regulatory controls will apply? And FDA largely makes that determination based on the classification of the medical device, which is in turn determined by FDA's assessment of the level of risk and the regulatory controls that are necessary to control those risks, right? Provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. That classification scheme is essentially divided into 3 classes. Class 1 are the lowest risk devices, Class 2 are moderate risk devices, and Class 3 are the highest risk devices. And FDA makes that assessment based on classification regulations that it issues, defining a plethora of generic device types by general description of those devices. And so if your device functionality and the intended use fits within one of those generic device types, existing in a classification regulation, then that classification regulation then dictates the regulatory controls that apply to the device. If there is no general classification regulation that's been issued for the type of device at issue, then the device is automatically classified into Class 3, even if it's not particularly risky, right? Just because it's novel, there isn't a classification regulation yet for that type of device. Importantly, the classification of the device determines the pathway to market, and there are 3 general paths to market for devices where a device is not otherwise exempt from marketing review. And these include a 510K pre-market notification or a 510K clearance, a PMA approval, and then a pathway that's sort of in the middle called a de novo classification. The 510K pathway is the least onerous of the pre-market review pathways. It requires a demonstration only that the device is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed predicate device, not that the device is, quote, safe and effective for its intended use. And that's a standard that must be met for Class 3 devices that are subject to PMA approval. Novel devices that don't fall within an existing classification regulation, as I mentioned, are automatically classified as Class 3, even if they aren't particularly risky, which means that they would traditionally be subject to this onerous PMA approval process. But to calibrate FDA and industry resources with respect to a low to moderate risk device that's automatically classified into Class 3 because of its novelty, FDA has this de novo classification process that offers a path to market for those types of devices. So a key feature of the existing FDA regulatory framework is that if the device is of the type that requires pre-market review, which is the case for most Class 2 and Class 3 devices, any change to the device after marketing authorization could require a new pre-market authorization before the modified device can be marketed and those changes can be implemented. Or else there's a risk that the product that you're marketing it without an effective marketing authorization that covers the change. And of course, that's pretty significant for the devices that we're talking about today.
Well, that truly is the rub when we talk about artificial intelligence. That is the pre-market review requirements and the need to seek a new FDA clearance or pre-market review in connection with a device change. When we marry that basic framework, which FDA has operated under for decades, to artificial intelligence, we quickly see the issue. Because AI and machine learning devices, by definition, take real-world clinical data inputs and using those new inputs, produce a different output based on a updated algorithm that the device may implement itself due to its ability to engage in machine learning. The benefits of that are quite obvious. The ability for a device to train itself to identify disease markers, to engage in diagnoses, can lead to earlier detection of diseases, more accurate diagnoses, and ultimately the development of personalized medicine. that benefit of being able to take real world evidence and improve performance of algorithms and devices in an expedited manner stands to benefit the public health. But we still need to address this question of at what point does a manufacturer of an AI technology need to go back to FDA and obtain a new clearance. So I think here we need to understand the downsides of AI and what FDA would care about and why they would want to exert ongoing authority over these products. The first is that the output of a device, whether a software device or a more traditional medical device, is only as good as the input. So when we talk about AI devices, we need to understand the quality of the data set that the algorithm is running and account for potential biases if you miss a subpopulation or sort of other aspects of that data set that may yield a less effective predictive mechanism based on errors in the data set that are provided at the input stage. At the back end, there's also the black box concept. Traditionally, FDA would prefer that a physician in the clinic would be able to reach the same determination on their own without relying on an algorithm, say with respect to a diagnosis, so that a device that spits out a positive diagnosis for a disease or condition, FDA would prefer that the physician itself can understand how that algorithm worked, why it reached the determination it did, and so on. When we talk about cutting edge AI technologies, that's not often possible. Those algorithms often operate in what we call a black box, which means as a practical matter that the physician has no idea what it does, how it's reaching the result, and spitting it out. I know, Liz, you'll expand on this a bit later in terms of a case study, but ultimately those are sort of the concerns that cause FDA to exert authority over these products and ensure that they have some mechanism to control pre-market review down the road. Another point here I think that is important to make is that traditionally FDA, when reviewing algorithms, has focused on locked algorithms, that is algorithms that provide the same result every time the same input is applied to it. As you suggested, Liz, the general rule is that a modification to a locked algorithm cannot be implemented without pre-market review in cases where the modification introduces new or modified risks of significant harm or otherwise significantly affects the functionality or performance specifications of the device. These are largely subjective determinations insofar as the manufacturer needs to identify what a significant effect may be or significant harm may be caused by a modification. And it typically entails a large amount of work to validate the software change, to assess the impact of the modification on the overall working of the device, and where necessary to obtain and seek pre-market review of that modification before implementation. Obviously, that takes time, weeks, months as a general matter. When we're talking about machine learning AIs, that happens in real time. So, the bottom line is that the existing regulatory framework has a potential to stifle development of continuously learning and adaptive technologies if the application of the framework requires regulatory review of such modifications in all cases. So this presents a real challenge to FDA in addressing the circumstances under which changes to machine learning and AI algorithms should trigger increased FDA oversight versus the means by which FDA should facilitate innovation in this space.
That sounds like a real predicament. What is the FDA doing to address these challenges?
Well, over the past several years, FDA has taken a number of actions. They've been a bit scattershot. I can't say that FDA has had a consolidated approach to AI, but they have issued a series of guidance documents on various attributes of AI machine learning as they relate to the current pre-market review process for devices. And I think the headline there is that FDA has acknowledged that the current regulatory framework is not well suited to these types of technologies. And as such, FDA needs to think about ways to improve or modernize the system to capture these machine learning mechanisms. So among other things, over the last few years, FDA has issued standalone guidances to companies with software-based devices to help industry evaluate whether changes to existing devices require new pre-market submissions and so on.
Yeah, in addition to the standalone guidance, that Ben mentioned, FDA in the last couple of years has been fairly active. In 2017, the agency published its Digital Health Innovation Action Plan, which provided, details and timelines on an integrated approach to digital health technology, to explain how the agency planned to establish, clear and consistent expectations for the products that it regulates. And, the goal of the plan was to foster innovation while continuing to, do FDA's job in protecting and promoting public health. One major component of that plan that's really relevant to, AI and machine learning based devices was FDA's announcement of the launch of what it called the Precertification pilot program. And as the name implies, this is a pilot program that FDA launched to inform the development of a future regulatory model to apply to software-based medical devices to provide more streamlined and efficient regulatory oversight, given the unique features of these products and FDA's recognition that its current regulatory framework just doesn't work, with respect to these products. So importantly, and distinct from the existing regulatory framework applicable to these products, that model would look to the developer and the manufacturer of the product to pre-certify the firm as having a robust compliance system, to establish a system of trust in the firm, to essentially enable a world where there's less red tape for those developers and manufacturers that have been pre-certified, so that they can iterate and improve their products once they hit the market, again, without all the red tape that there currently exists. Pre-certified companies would have to submit less information. In some cases, they wouldn't be required to submit for pre-market review at all before marketing, certain products. They would be obligated to collect post-market data to ensure that the product remains safe and effective through the life cycle of the product. And again, that's a different approach than FDA currently takes, where it focuses on the product. It reviews the product, not the firm. A couple years later, in 2019, FDA issued a discussion paper seeking feedback on a proposed regulatory framework for modifications to AI and machine learning-based software as a medical device. And that's exactly the types of circumstances that we've been discussing thus far, and how FDA's framework just doesn't work right in the real world. The discussion paper acknowledges that these technologies have potential to transform healthcare, and as such, they're really forcing FDA to reimagine its approach to pre-market review for AI and machine learning driven software modifications. The purpose, of course, is to allow the software to continue to evolve and learn over time, so that we can continue improving patient care while maintaining reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness of the device as required under the law. And at bottom, the discussion paper proposes a total product lifecycle approach to the regulation of these technologies, and it leverages pretty significantly from the principles in the Precert pilot program. FDA does note, though, that to implement these changes to this framework, it's going to need new or amended statutory authority. So there's ultimately going to be some legislative component that will be necessary to get there. The end goal, though, would be to ensure that ongoing algorithm changes are implemented in accordance with a pre-specified performance objective, that they follow predefined algorithm change protocols, and that there's a validation process that would include real-world monitoring through the entire life cycle of the device. So in implementing this approach, FDA would assess, again, the culture and quality of the organizational excellence of the company. So again, this is a firm-focused approach to medical device regulation rather than, as we currently have, a product-focused approach. And in practice, manufacturers would submit this plan with respect to modifications that might be made to their device after marketing during the pre-market review stage. They'd be describing the types of anticipated modifications that could occur in the real world based on, the retraining that would occur using the algorithm. And if the modifications are within those set boundaries, then a pre-market review for those modifications may not be required. And so again, a key component is also the post-market transparency on the real-world performance and periodic reporting to FDA to just be sure that as the product continues to iterate while it's on the market, we're continuing to maintain assurances of safety and efficacy. More recently, and just earlier this year, I think in February of this year, FDA held a public meeting focused on the application of these proposals in a case study of one type of medical device utilizing AI and machine learning, and that was in the case of breast cancer imaging technologies. These technologies have been evolving over the years, starting with CAD mammography to become more and more sensitive in detecting breast lesions that are suspicious for cancer and digital mammograms. And considering the vast amount of data generated from a very specific exam type, there's something like 33 to 39 million screening mammograms a year in the US. These systems can adapt from, starting out as an aid in diagnosis to then producing confidence scores that, assist radiologists in making more of a definitive diagnosis. And on the flip side, the technologies might evolve, through real world use to become so good at what they do that they can produce such a high negative predictive value that it could be determined that a radiologist need not review the images at all. So the future of these technologies could ultimately lead to an autonomous AI system that neither aids nor assists a radiologist, but rather replaces the radiologist to autonomously detect or diagnose lesions. And as you can imagine, that could have a dramatic effect on healthcare. It could bring great benefits, but it also has the potential for risk. For one, an autonomous adaptive AI imaging system could reduce a radiologist's workload to enable the radiologist to focus more on critical cases, right? Sort of weeding out those cases that don't require a radiologist's review. On the other hand, there are risks of false negatives or false positives or, frankly, missing secondary findings that the algorithm isn't trained to look for, but that the radiologist would otherwise see. And these are all things FDA is thinking about against the backdrop that there's already a significant amount of human variation in sensitivity of finding cancer on these screening mammograms. And whether a particular image is positive or actionable today largely depends on the radiologist reviewing the image. Recognizing the need to continue to work at how to address these kinds of products, FDA more recently launched its Digital Health Center of Excellence in September 2020 to focus specifically on the advancement of digital health technologies, including AI and machine learning. And of course, subsequently, in response to stakeholder feedback on the 2019 discussion paper that we just talked about, and in light of the public health need to facilitate, innovation of this type of medical device, using AI and machine learning based software, and the need to provide oversight, appropriate oversight for those types of products. FDA most recently published its AI machine learning based software as a medical device action plan to summarize the feedback received from stakeholders on the other actions it's taken in this area, and to describe a 5-part action plan that it seeks to implement to advance its work in this area. And among other things, that plan includes FDA's announced intention to flesh out some of its earlier proposals, including through issuance of draft guidance on, predetermined change control plans that were described in the 2019 discussion paper, establishing a harmonized approach to the development of what's called good machine learning practices, FDA's plans to hold public workshops on transparency of AI and machine learning based devices to users, as well as plans to flesh out, certain issues that are particularly important to AI and machine learning based devices, such as, vulnerability to bias in light of the use of historical data sets. And finally, improving clarity on the concept of real world performance monitoring for those devices through pilot programs.
Yeah, so I think the inescapable conclusion here is that AI and machine learning do stand to bring vast benefits to the public health in the coming decade and years as these technologies are developed. But we have to caution that the future of this industry is predicated on a regulatory structure that's simply unsuited for it. And I think, as you described, Liz, FDA is certainly aware of the issue and certainly aware of the risks that these technologies create. The question will then become, how they manage it on a going forward basis.
So, following up on that, Ben, it definitely seems like quite a paradigm shift is being undertaken at the moment, and that what we're seeing at the FDA is a bit of a struggle to come to terms with how these technologies fit within this current regulatory structure. Liz, you'd mentioned a number of initiatives and proposals that the FDA has explored and has put forth in recent years. But where do you expect these initiatives or proposals to head in light of our recent election here in the United States and the change from a Trump administration to a Biden administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, as you've heard, FDA is thinking really hard about this, as evidenced by, all the flurry of activity it's taken over the last several years. And obviously, it's still seeking input from industry and the public as to how it can adapt and adjust its policies. And look, the technology isn't going anywhere. If anything, we expect to see more of it in the future, right, through innovation. So to that end, I don't think we expect any major deviation from these efforts to enable innovation while maintaining safety and efficacy with an incoming Biden administration. Though, of course, FDA acknowledges the need for congressional action to make any real change. So there would need to be a change in the laws or new laws enacted to allow for the kinds of regulatory flexibilities that FDA has contemplated. I wouldn't be surprised to see greater enforcement action against bad actors or folks who are really skirting the line with their products today. And it's also worth noting that, Biden's spoken to the importance of science and research and development, and has proposed to increase federal R&D spending, including to benefit key technologies like AI. So not expecting a huge sea change with respect to FDA's approach to this, and obviously certainly important to keep abreast of the regulatory developments.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would note that there is some remaining ambiguity about what precisely we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence and algorithms. There is some debate about how FDA should classify these technologies, particularly with respect to the proposed structures that you described, Liz, of a firm-focused approach to medical device regulation as opposed to a product-focused approach. That's unusual for FDA, and I think it's evident as we sit here today that FDA has yet to identify best practices across the industry under this firm-focused model, such that manufacturers who are seeking to develop these technologies will have a transparent and comprehensive understanding of what the FDA requirements would be for those technologies. So I anticipate that over the next several months, FDA will focus largely on its pre-certification program and understanding the internal practices that companies have imposed to understand and validate real-time changes to their algorithms as they collect real-world evidence on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
Liz and Ben, thanks so much. We're going to wrap things up at this point, but this was a fantastic discussion, and we really appreciate you taking the time to walk us all through this complicated topic. There's clearly a shift in the regulatory landscape that companies in this space need to carefully consider as they seek to exploit AI and machine learning in the healthcare arena.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure to join today.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics we've discussed today, please email us from links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Connected with Latham.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins, LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins, LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins, LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 885 3rd Avenue, New York, New York, 10022-4834. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.